Hello and welcome to week 2 of our online book club, reading the final document of the Synod Assembly Together. I'm Avril Baigent, one of the co-founders of the School for Synodality, a project designed to help the Church rise to the challenge of becoming a more listening and discerning missionary community. We began our series last week with Father Jos Moons, exploring the theological foundations of synodality. We had a fantastic conversation about the importance of baptism, the role of the Holy Spirit in the Church, and the need right now to just jump in and try some things. If you missed it, you can find it on our YouTube channel or on the webinar page of our website. Tonight, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Anna Rowlands. Anna is the St Hilda Professor of Catholic Social Thought and Practice at Durham University, a political theologian whose book, Towards a Politics of Communion, Catholic Social Teaching for Dark Times, won an award from the Benedict XVI Vatican Foundation. More recently, she has been seconded to the Vatican to work as part of a team supporting the worldwide synod process. If the name and face are sounding strangely familiar, Anna has also been regularly on the BBC and other press during the death of Pope Francis and the recent election and inauguration mass of Pope Leo. So delighted to have you with us, Anna. It's just a joy.
Thanks for having me.
Tonight, we will be discussing part 2 of the final document, The Conversion of Relationships. The format of our book club is that Anna and I will chat for 30 to 40 minutes and then we will open for questions. And after last week, we know that you will have plenty to say. So if you're watching this live, please do use the chat to say hello and share thoughts, which we will pick up after the main input. However, we know that some people find the chat distracting, so you can switch it off at any time by clicking the X button on the top right-hand panel of the chat. Hopefully that means that those who want to chat can chat and those who want to concentrate will just get to get the glory of the conversation in full. However, before we get started, let's begin in prayer. And we just take a moment from the busyness of our days, for all that's in the news at the moment, and for everything else that is going on with us, just to lay that down as we enter this space together. Last week we had a global space stretching from New Zealand all the way round to the US and Canada. And we are grateful again for our global online community. So, Father God, we thank you that you have given us such fellowship and such commitments to building and renewing your church. We ask that you send your Holy Spirit on us tonight, that our hearts might be burning within us and that we might feel truly inspired to build your kingdom in our community. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. So, Anna, my very first question before we dive into the content of the chapter is just to tell us something about, you've had a very particular experience of synodality. Tell us a little bit about what the last 3 years have been like.
Gosh, so yeah, I have had a very unusual experience, I suppose, of engaging in the synodal journey. And in a way, I've had the reverse of most people's experience, which is that my role has been at the level of the whole church, if you like, to support the process in Rome. And my involvement began really with what became called the Continental Stage document, the Frascati document. And I was asked at that point if I would go along to Rome and be part of a group of people who would read every single one of those local reports that came in from the churches and the individual submissions. So a huge number of people from all over the world wrote physical letters, sent emails, groups sent submissions, movements sent submissions as well. So I'm one of probably about 3 people in the whole world who I think has read pretty much everything, including the letters from people who said, I know nobody's going to read this. I read it. And actually, in all seriousness, it was really important that those people who thought that they would be discarded or their views wouldn't count were read. So my immersion in synodality was actually sort of from this sort of above level position, in the sense of receiving all of these reports that had come from the richness of the grassroots process and then beginning to discern the themes that were present in those. So I consider myself to have had an extraordinarily privileged access, in a sense, to that voice, that discernment from the grassroots, that I think has guided the synodal process. And so, from my perspective, I've then been involved in both of the assemblies and the kind of implementation stage as well now. And I think, hand on heart, the one thing that I most want to convey to people from my experience is the seriousness with which those submissions were taken, and the fact that I can see a thread that runs through from those individual submissions, including individual letters, right the way through to the final document. I can see the threads that connect those. So from my perspective, there's all sorts of things we can critique about it, we can learn from it, we could have done better, there was mistakes made, but there is a fundamental honesty in the process, and in essence where we are now, I think, from that original process. And I'm proud and privileged to have been part of that.
So that's actually just so exciting to hear. Like, we were running around in the middle of a COVID wave trying to get people to come out. They'd never heard of the word synod before, had no idea what we were doing. You know, people in our diocese were putting on evenings for 3 people to come out to. And yet all of that really was honoured, and and we saw it. I saw some of that myself, kind of tracking through from the diocesan to the kind of national document to the international document. So, but it's lovely to know that from your perspective that carried on, and that those really were honoured. So we're looking at section 2 tonight, the conversion of relationships. Can you just give us a kind of a framing or an overview of the standout ideas of the section?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you asked me to talk about this section, because not only because it's got the section on women in it, and I think it's really important that women talk about the section that women are in, as well as men talking about that as well, but because this is probably like my favorite section, in the sense that it frames everything for me where the conversation should be anchored and should begin, which is in relationships. And this isn't because it's some kind of pseudo therapeutic version of the church. This isn't like the church's therapy. Therapy has its place in life, but the point is that this is richly theological, but in a way that totally is about concrete, ordinary, everyday things. So it's like the most truthful, the most mysterious, and yet also the most practical, in a way, point in the document for me. It manages to do all of those things simultaneously. And the reason that, I mean, obviously, you'll see as you go through the book club that each of these main sections begins with the notion of conversion, the conversion of relationships, the conversion of structures, the conversion of bonds. And we had to start with relationships because that's the basic reality of the church. The church exists in and through relationships. It simply is who and what the church is. And that's from the Trinity, so our Trinitarian understanding of our doctrine of God, to our understanding of human creation. And I know you're going to ask me a question about relationships. I don't want to say too much more about that now, because I think you're going to come back to this. But I do think we need to begin by saying it's anchored in something which is totally theological. It's the nature of the church itself. And it's also the richness, it's the wealth and the richness of the church is in our relationships. So it's right and true and proper that it should begin there. What's also interesting to me is, going back to the question of those grassroots reports that were submitted, what did people say to us? They said to us, if the synodal process can renew, can reweave, if you like, the relational fabric of the church, it will do something of profound importance for mission. So just that, the first, I won't do too much of reading chunks of the document, don't worry, but just that first line of paragraph 50 that opens this section after the little biblical reflection, this is exactly what people said distilled. What emerged throughout the entire synodal journey and in every place and context was the call for a church with a greater capacity to nurture relationships with the Lord, that's where relationships begin, between men and women, in the family, in the local community, among social groups and religions, and with all of creation. And that's true. So not only is it how we would understand the church to be anyway, but the call and response of the synodal process meant that the grassroots said back to us, we want you to talk about the relationships that structure the basic existence of the life of the church. Now, that opening sentence there of paragraph 50 is basically the hinge of the whole of this chapter, because the rest of the chapter goes on to talk about the need to renew that basic relationship with Jesus Christ, first and foremost, between men and women, This is paragraph 50, 10 paragraphs on from here, not very long afterwards, we get to paragraph 60, which is precisely about renewing that relationality between men and women, the reciprocal relationships between men and women. It talks about the rest of the document as it carries on from there, goes through this list then of talking about children, of young people, of those with living with disabilities. It talks about family life. It even talks about theologians and the kind of reciprocal duties of theologians in service to the church in a communal and collegial way. And then it talks about ordained ministries. Now, for me, that first sentence frames the whole of this chapter and really helps us understand that flow of relationship and relationality. But it also helps us understand, why did this chapter pick out the particular groupings that it does as it goes through women and men, young people and children, those with disabilities, etc. Because that's what the local reports talked about as priority questions that needed attention, i.e., in particular, where are we falling short? Where is there a real need for deep healing, conversion, justice within the life of the church in its relationships, such that we live the relationships that the gospel calls us to more fully and completely, not simply for our own sake, but for mission, for the sake of what we do for the world. So for me, the whole chapter hangs together around that relational framing, and everything in it, including the section on ordained ministries at the end, is set within a completely relational key. And it all flows in exactly the way that Lumen Gentium, the document on the church from the Second Vatican Council, flows. It talks about this beautiful image of the whole people of God. And then it talks about hierarchical ministries, which are not separate from the whole people of God. Ordained ministries are situated within. Your bishop and your priests are part of the people of God. And very deliberately, the document doesn't talk about laity and ordained in a binary way. It's this beautiful vision of the unity of the single call in baptism to mission and holiness, and the plurality of expressions of that we then can name and think about in really concrete and tangible ways. And the last thing I'll say just about the framing, because I've already spoken for too long, is that's really important to me is the whole image of this, or the language and imaginary of this chapter, is not only about the richness of the church lying in its relationships and its basic character being relational, but also that abundance is the basic characteristic of our life together. So we're so used to, in this cultural moment that we live in, living with a social imagination that's shaped around the idea of scarcity and competition. And the entire whole of this document is rooted in a completely different imaginary, which is of abundance. The Spirit constantly is pouring out an abundance of gifts and charisms. Can you see them? Can you discern them? Can you put them to use for mission? And can you do that as a whole community? And this is never an economy of competition. It's one of cooperation and one of communion. So the very kind of imagery of it, beginning with this idea of the abundant catch, is really to help us shift the way in which we think about things that might feel like challenges in the life of the church, rerouting us in a language, an economy of gift, of abundance, of cooperation, and of communion. And that for me is hopeful, uplifting, theologically correct, and an appropriate response to the things that we heard from the grassroots.
Anna, don't apologize for talking too much. We could just sit and listen to you talking like that all night. It is so exciting and joyful, really, to hear that framing of that second section, particularly about just, depth of relationships, but also abundance. Look, we get loads of questions at the School for Synodality about, what is synodality and what isn't it? And, the whole thing about when something doesn't quite go away, well, that's not very synodal, and, you didn't do. And I think that for lots of people, perhaps there's been quite a concentration on listening and listening groups and discerning and taking decisions. Isn't starting with relationships a bit fluffy? Why does this document have to be rooted in relation? Why can't we just cut to the decision making and, get over all of this tricky bit first?
So, I mean, it goes back to a slightly longer version, is the bad news of what I was just saying a minute ago, which is the language that we use to describe what the church is, when people say, well, what's the church? The church is the body of Christ. What's the church? It's the temple of the Holy Spirit. What's the church? It's the bride of Christ. What's the church? It's the people of God. Each of those images is inescapably about relationship. You can't be St. Paul's image of the body of Christ. You can't be a spouse as an entity of Christ. You can't be the people of God without proposing the notion of a self and an other and a community. So that sense that the church is relational in its very being is crucial. So if you're going to produce a text which tells the truth about the very nature of the church, you can't get to questions about decision making and structures unless we have recalled who we are and the journey that we are on. And so this begins in a way that's not fluffy, but is appropriately humble in the sense, and what do I mean by humble? In that regard, I mean, how do we live and breathe and have our being? We have it entirely as gift, and we have it because of a divine creator. We're creatures of a creator. That's our basic anthropology. So we already, our very existence is as beneficiaries of a relationship. And that's held within a relationship within the Godhead, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And everything within the life of the church is shaped by those fundamental realities of creature and creator, of a Trinitarian God, and our reality flows outwards from that. So I don't see how it could have started anywhere else, especially if you're structuring it around this call to conversion for the sake of mission, than to begin with relationships. So it's just sort of theologically true, I think. The other thing that we might say from a sort of more practical perspective, if that's a bit sort of lofty and metaphysical for people, then, two ways of grounding it slightly more practically is, if you're desperate for change, and there are some people who want no change and they feared the synodal process because they thought it was all about change and not about conservation, and it wasn't about tradition, and it was all about kind of ripping things up and breaking things. And I don't think it was about that, but whether you wanted change or you didn't want change, change was a question in the air. If you want to nurture and grow, so let's not use change language, but if you want to nurture and grow relationship, the only way that you can do that is, or the church community, is to accept that you've got to focus on relationships, because relationships are what enable continuity and change, a living tradition. So from a practical point of view, nothing will change and nothing will deepen or grow if you can't speak in the language of relationships. So I think we sort of had to do it from that perspective. And then finally, I think what's really interesting is to think a little bit about even the words, almost in grammar terms, that we used for synodality. So they're almost like the gerunds, if you like, and verbs of the process: to listen, to be in dialogue, to discern, to welcome, to integrate. They're all verbs that imply relationship to a self, to another, to a community. So the whole structure, the very practices of synodality, as well as our notion of what the church is, mean that I don't think that we could start anywhere else. And I think it's the opposite of something that's kind of fluffy or therapeutic. I think it's properly and intrinsically Catholic. And again, we live in a moment that's dominated by the idea of the asserting, egotistical, choosing, self-creating individual. And everything about the vision of synodality is a different story about what it means to be human, and to be human within a community of other humans, within a created world. And that storyline is so enabling, and it's refreshing, and it's hopeful, and it's exactly the antidote that we need for thinking about how we build communities that are resilient and healthy and life-giving in a moment when community is fracturing. So I, as you can tell, welcome the fact that it begins with a relational anthropology.
Thank you. And so this then drives a kind of reimagining in the document around charisms and ministries, or certainly, if not a reimagining, certainly a kind of a pause for thought in the document, where it wants to relate charisms and ministries to this notion of speaking to a rapidly changing world, and how are we church in that outward looking mode.
Yeah, and again, I think one of the really important things about the way that this chapter talks about ministries and charisms is it constantly uses the language of service. So ministries are, I mean, it's in the etymology of the word, but ministries are a form of service, and they're a service to meet real needs in a missionary context. So it places ministries in their relational context, it places them in terms of their purpose. And it's very clear, and I think this is one of the things that is quite interesting, that ministries meet material and moral needs. So, deacons in particular, the document talks about diaconal ministry and the service of charity, about the preferential option for the poor, about relieving suffering in the world. That runs through the document. So this is about meeting people's deepest spiritual, moral, and material needs. And the charisms and the ministries of the church are in service to the meeting of those needs. And then it has I think quite an interesting way of sort of reminding us about certain crucial things about thinking about ministries and charism, some of which are a bit technical and theological, and some of which are just, again, really refreshing. So it talks about the freedom of the Spirit to bestow charisms, vocations, as the Spirit wills. There is this, you can't stop or frustrate what comes from the Spirit. That's one of the lines that's in paragraph 60, where it's talking about the question of women. But it's also there in those sections talking about charisms and ministries more generally. And that pulls our attention back to when it talks about the role of the priest and the role of the bishop, in particular, the ministry of the bishop in particular, is how are we as a community discerning together the charisms and ministries appropriate to that are being poured out freely by the Spirit into the community for the sake of meeting the mission needs of the world now. And a key role for the bishop is as an enabler of the discernment of those charisms and those missional needs. So it pulls us back. It's a great framing, but then the kind of the hard landing of it, again in a good way, is, and who is responsible for helping us to discern these questions of charisms and ministries? And of course, the document, helpfully, from a theological perspective, reminds us that not all charisms are ministries, and yet all ministries are, in a sense, formalized, publicly recognized charisms. And then it goes on to make the helpful distinction that not all ministries need to be instituted ministries. They don't need to all be formalized. Some will be non-instituted ministries, and it calls for a greater exploration of that space of ministries that are not instituted, as well as some more that could be instituted. So there's a whole kind of opening of a space that's a little bit technical, probably for people who are not so interested in some of those theological distinctions. But that's actually a really fruitful space in the document where it tries to think through what are the ministries that are appropriate to meeting the mission needs of our context right now, and discerning what the Spirit is doing, where those mission needs are, and bringing that together within a community where the bishop in particular is responsible for the unity of that community. That's really important. So for me, it's a really rich setting out of a stall around how we could begin to think more about charisms and ministries. And it doesn't settle that question. It's not a kind of closed, finished piece of work. It's a further exploration that would require further exploration of the question of charisms and ministries, but very much focused on the question of mission and discerning the action of the Spirit.
Just thinking, Anna, I chucked that at you without being thoughtful myself, but can you just give us the distinction between charisms and ministries? Because it is a bit technical.
Yeah, but so the document basically talks about the kind of charisms that can be present in the community, charisms that are poured out, and ministries which are formally instituted ministries. So something which is formally recognized and given the name ministry in the church. So the ministry of the deacon, the ministry of the priest, the ministry of the bishop, etc. Then you can have some non-instituted ministries, so which can kind of operate in the space of ministries. And I'm trying to remember I'll find it and come back to it in a minute, but there's a paragraph that sets out examples of those, so that people have some sense of what that means. Here we go, paragraph 66. So it begins by talking about the mission involves all of the baptized, And the first task of all lay men and women is to permeate and transform earthly realities in the spirit of the gospel. That belongs to everyone. So it's not some people do sort of mission and ministry, and then there's the rest of us who just go to mass. It's very much this is the responsibility of all the baptized. But it then goes on to say this response should involve discernment amongst the various charisms in order to identify which of these should take a ministerial form and thus be equipped with adequate criteria, tools, etc. And then it goes on to say, not all charisms need to be configured as ministries, nor do all the baptized need to become ministers, nor do all ministries need to be instituted. And then it goes on to sort of set out how some of those ministries might be configured. But that, so basically sort of paragraph 66 and 67. And it basically urges at the end of that there should be more research, particularly theological research, to deepen our understanding of charisms and ministries and to explore which ministries should be instituted and which shouldn't. And one concrete example, Avril, that you will remember from across the synod process was a recommendation that in the end wasn't formalised absolutely in the final document, that a listening ministry should be created in parishes. And this was debated on this borderline of, would this be a kind of formalised ministry? Would it not be a formalised ministry? What would it mean to do that? So in the end, it was left for a further level of study and reflection, because there wasn't really agreement on whether something like a listening ministry could become, as it were, a formalised ministry in the life of the church or not. So there's an encouragement to kind of experiment and try out the format and see, and there would be an ongoing discernment of that question. Yeah.
Well, this is all, I mean, it could sound a little bit technical, and certainly when you're reading the documents, some of it can sound more technical than other bits. Actually, when we were exploring with Jos last week about the foundation of synodality being the vocation of all the baptized, this is just a kind of a straight line through from that first set of ideas, and to say, like, and how do we express that? How, and these are some different ways in which we can express our vocation of our baptism. I wonder if this is the point to sort of dive into the paragraph 60 stuff. I think it's really right that, that we, as you said, that it's women talking about this within the church. Obviously, we want everybody to be talking about it. Will you just give us a little, a kind of a, what were the standout ideas even from that little paragraph for you, and what might we take away from it?
So in order to situate this paragraph, one of the things we need to do is, in fact, go back to the Frascati document and see what happens to the writing of the synod process on the question of women all the way through. So the breakthrough moment in terms of finding a common language to speak about this question in happened as a response to the grassroots reports. So what now is in paragraph 60 on the equal dignity of all the baptized, of men and women, that as a foundation point for the way in which the synodal process would talk about the question of women and their place and role in the church, that emerged, that was given to the writers of the documents, as it were, from those original grassroots reports, because that was the language that the grassroots reports spoke in, that they wanted the equal baptismal dignity of men and women to be recognised, to be honoured, as it were, in the church and in the synodal process. And they wanted that to be generally affirmed theologically, but they also wanted concrete measures that would enable that to be better recognised. And there were 2 or 3 universal sort of themes that emerged from those original grassroots reports from all over the world, one of which was about formation, and in particular better formation for preaching, but more generally the availability of high quality formation. And the other was particularly around women and the question of the role and place of women in church and society. So sometimes it was more focused on society and the church speaking for women in situations of societal abuse, and sometimes it was much more focused on the church. So this was a universal theme, and it needed therefore to be attended to very carefully. And that I can say hand on heart that the framing language, at very least, that's used for paragraph 60 came from those grassroots reports. And it's been honoured as a framing mechanism through each of the paragraphs. And you can go back and flick through the Frascati document, the various Instrumentum Laboris, and the first synthesis report and the final document, and you'll find the same disciplined language used to frame it. So that is really important. The second feature that's really distinctive compared to other documents produced by the Vatican in a more formal magisterial way on the question of women, this text uses the language of reciprocity rather than formal complementarity to talk about the relation between men and women. Now, that's interesting. It doesn't mean that the Synod was saying complementarian language can't be used anywhere at any point, or it's being completely.
Anna, I'm just going to jump in and say,
yeah.
give us a definition of what's the nuance of the difference between those two?
So traditionally, in recent years, in recent decades, the Church has tended to adopt formal complementarian language, i.e., that the relationship between men and women is rooted in biological essential difference, and that there is a kind of complementary but different, but strongly differentiated set of roles and even characteristics in some instances that one might associate with men and women. And it has to be said clearly that Pope Francis followed largely in that line of thinking himself. So he talked a lot about the kind of Marian characteristics of women as nurturing, women using strongly biological maternal language, and that men had much more a kind of Petrine nature. And so he kind of had his own version via von Balthasar, a Swiss German theologian. He had his own version of kind of adopting elements of that. But the Synod documents didn't choose to use that language. They didn't reject it and say it was impossible for others to use, but they did focus strongly on the idea that they wanted to talk mainly about a reciprocity, that relationships between men and women could be thought of as reciprocal relationships rather than complementarian relationships. So it's an interesting shift in the language of the text itself. And I think that's something that should and can stimulate debate moving forwards. Just a couple of other things about the text. Obviously, the text of paragraph 60, as you can imagine, was long debated. And you'll remember that an original draft of these documents was always presented to the different synod assemblies and groups. And then they would have an opportunity to make amendments, to suggest and propose amendments. And I have to be careful about how I put this, but I think it's safe to say that probably the most commented upon passage in terms of the volume of amendments, it won't surprise you, was probably in this area. So that in itself is kind of interesting because it suggests a heightened sensitivity to thinking about this question, and that it really mattered. No matter whether you were male or female, framing this language really mattered. So it reads as a text that's been highly amended in the sense of it's had lots and lots of kind of amendments. So sometimes it reads in a slightly more staccato way than some of the other parts of the text that perhaps were subject to fewer amendments. But it does mean that what's here is genuinely what could be assented to by the majority of that very highly diverse assembly, who held very different views between them on basic gender anthropology, sexual difference, the practical role of men and women in the life of the church. So this is what could genuinely hold at a global level as common language. And I think approaching it with a kind of understanding of that is in a way quite helpful, because people can read it and immediately think, oh, it should have said this, or oh, I really wish it hadn't said that. But this was a text that could pass that vote and could draw the assent of most people in the room to the positive statements in here. And that in itself is something quite interesting. It says very clearly that there is nothing that means that women shouldn't occupy the highest possible roles in the church, that they shouldn't be involved in every aspect of the life of the church. It notes openly that women continue to face obstacles in obtaining a fuller recognition of their charisms, their vocations, and their places within the life of the church. And it makes positive calls in various areas, particularly in relation to the provision of canon law. I think it was genuinely a surprise to some of the bishops and cardinals that there were provisions in canon law that already existed that are not being utilised. And that even at that level, there could be radical change if you really use to the maximum those provisions that exist within canon law. And it does also say that the question of women's access to diaconal ministry remains open. And there were points in the process where it looked like that might not be the case. We should also note, of course, that study group 5 is still to report. And therefore, there will be a whole series of reflections that take us way beyond paragraph 60. They're not ones that will have been voted on. So they will emerge from a slightly different part of the process. But in essence, this is a kind of provisional statement, as it were, from the synod members themselves, awaiting what might come by way of further elucidation.
It was such a moment, really, in the assembly. I do remember, on my table, a real diversity. And even one of the women on the table saying, like, I don't know what I think about women's ministry in the church. I feel like I come from quite a traditional society. I don't really know. And then one of the bishops saying, well, I know what I think because the women of my diocese have told me, and I'm bringing the women of my diocese into the room. And so there was such a kind of a proper listening from around the table, and like, my gosh, from the countries that across the world in my group. So it was quite an amazing process of the Holy Spirit to see that emerging, something that could be signed up for. And then when the vote went through, the sort of relief in the room that it had gone through. And really the kind of the essence of synodality is to work out, how do we walk together and make these moves. But I remember a few weeks ago, I was doing a talk for our National Board of Catholic Women, and I'd gone back and I'd read through the text. And actually, the Synod Office on International Women's Day issued a really nice set of the text. So you can see all the text through from the Frascati document onwards. And there was this moment where it says at the beginning of the paragraph on women in the Frascati document, there is a call from the women of the world to recognise the equal dignity, baptismal dignity of men and women. And the first line of paragraph 60 says, we recognise the equal dignity of men and women. And their hair went up on the back of my neck when I realised that this call that had come from the grassroots, and you read all of those documents, it wasn't a Western thing. This came from everywhere around the world, had actually been, there was a call and a response between the Frascati document, the listening that went on there, and what there was in that final paragraph which came through. So it was a very exciting moment. And I know that lots of women wanted different things. We're still in the process. We don't know where it's going at the moment. But it's so helpful to hear you chart like how far we've come already. And I think that's is a helpful thing. And I have my eye on the clock, and if I'm being a very rubbish facilitator, because we're going to be just chatting for the next hour and a half, and we'll have no time for questions, and everybody will have gone home. So I must move on. Tell us something about priests and deacons and bishops in this section as well, because I think it's fair to say that the other thing, there was a huge amount of conversation around the tables, was the role of the parish priest, and really how somehow that had sort of slipped through the process. I don't know quite how we would describe it. I'm sure the people in the secretariat would angrily reject my framing of that as they didn't slip through the process. But yeah, tell us a bit about that in the section.
So two things that can be said very quickly, I think, on this are that genuinely hand on heart, and I think the secretariat would accept this, the missing voice in the process was that of parish priests speaking for themselves. So priests speaking for themselves in their own voice. And there were moments when that suddenly became a bit more kind of to the fore. So they had the parish priest gathering in Rome. There was some context in which priests were really involved. So this wasn't a kind of globally equal process. But nonetheless, particularly in our own setting, and not only in our own setting, they were the key missing voice. And I think that was for multiple reasons. And it would take us too long this evening to list all of those reasons why I think priests were largely silent in that process. So much of what's in the document about priests is recognizing some of the things that priests did say when they did speak in their own voice. And some of that is some of the burdens and challenges and difficulties of ministry. Obviously, priests talked about the joy of their ministry, the blessings of their ministry, but they did also talk about their isolation and their loneliness. And I think we have to take that really seriously. And the danger is, again, of not recognizing that our priests are part of that whole people of God. And we have to behave, including as laity, we have to behave as if that really is true. And I think sometimes there isn't a felt sense of that for clergy. I think some of that is the legacy, the ongoing legacy of the abuse crisis. There are all sorts of reasons why I think that's happened in some contexts. But nonetheless, so talking about that as a realistic spiritual reality, pastoral reality for many priests, I think is important. But there's a positive vision in the document of priests in proximity to their people, and to a kind of synodal renewal of priesthood itself that is life-giving for priests, as well as for the rest of the community. And that this notion of a wider recognition of charisms, ministries, and vocations, of a genuinely co-responsibility for mission amongst all the baptized, that has to be deeply enabling and life-giving for priests. So the document partly spells that out. It also talks about the need for better quality of relationship between priests and their bishops, and some of the ways in which that can be challenging. And one of the surprise things, when you think this wasn't on the table in the early parts of the process, was the question of the role of the bishop, the ministry of the bishop, and the experience of the bishop became more and more important as the process went on. So there wasn't much of that in the grassroots reports. But actually, as the process went on and as bishops themselves gathered in Rome, they were much more willing to talk about, again, the blessings and burdens of their own roles, and to want to reimagine parts of episcopal ministry in ways that are creative and radical and really important. So bishops spoke up much more for themselves, those at least who were present as the process went on. And we need a parallel movement now during the implementation phase, when priests, I think, are able to speak for themselves. And just very quickly on the bishop's role, the document talks really beautifully about the sort of the integrating role of the bishop. So the bishop has this role in not just sort of overseeing, as it were, but this integrating role of holding together these various different aspects of the life of the local church. Of course, the bishop has a duty to proclaim, to teach, but also this kind of responsibility as a pastor for guarding unity, but a unity in plurality. So guarding the life of communion, and also the bishop's role in linking the people of that place to a communion of all the local churches. So being the kind of bridge in that setting as well. So, I think actually there's a huge amount of richness there. The document does also talk about the importance of more lay involvement in the selection of bishops. It talks about the importance of bishops being ordained in the diocese they're actually going to serve in. So that it's basically embedding, integrating, relating with a focus on service. That's the way in which I think the document reframes much about ministries.
That then becomes, when you see that leadership from the top, if you've then got co-responsible leadership from your bishop with the priest, it then models it then down, sort of then for priests to model it into clergy.
And I think what's interesting is to watch Pope Leo, because I think one of the things that Leo might do is almost imagine beyond where this document goes in terms of a synodal renewal of the papacy itself. In his first meeting with the cardinals after the Mass in the Sistine Chapel on the Saturday, I think it was, he got them to talk to each other. He got them to be in dialogue with each other. And he's emphasized that I'm going to walk with you, and I want you to walk with me, and we're going to meet more often, and this will be a substantial dialogue, and we're going to use basically a synodal method without sort of hammering it on the head. So I just wonder whether, in fact, it will also help if, in essence, there is this kind of synodal model of a papacy where the cardinals and the bishops and the priests experience that, and they experience that as life-giving. And we know that the thing that most convinces people that there's something worthwhile in the synodal process is to experience it. And the cardinals need to experience it from the Pope too.
Absolutely, absolutely. I wondered how the 60 odd who'd sat around the tables for the 2 months in the assembly felt about going back into kind of ranked rows when they were doing their kind of conversations ahead of the conclave. Must have been so strange for them. We're going to have to wrap up in a minute, but I just want to ask you, what do you think out of this? I mean, there's lots of reimagining of possibility in this section, I think, and I agree with you. It's one of my favourite sections as well. I think it's, if we were to take this seriously, let alone literally, it is so challenging just from a kind of parish perspective. But how, sort of for people thinking, well, what is the next? What can I do? What is the next step, or what can we do in parish land or more broadly? What for you would be a kind of a next step in terms of putting that into practice?
So I think most people, if they're really honest, know that the relational life of their local parish community um, could grow and be nurtured and could be the beneficiary of this process of the kind of conversion of relationships. And I think there are, other than people having an honest conversation with themselves, how do you view the relational fabric of your community? I mean, somebody in my own parish, and I belong to a fantastic parish that I'm very fond of. Somebody said to me recently, I've gone to the parish for 20 odd years, and I just feel like if I didn't show up one Sunday, nobody would notice and nobody would miss me. Now, in fact, that's not true, because I notice she's there every week, and I would notice if she wasn't there, but she feels that nobody would even notice if she just stopped going. And she feels this slight desolation about her relationship with her local parish. And I think there are a lot of people who feel that slight relational disconnect in their context. I also know many clergy, friends of mine who are ordained, who feel at times a bit like they're in a sort of, service industry, relationship where there's a lack of human understanding at times of their own need for friendship, to really be felt that they're part of the community, and for that whole people of God theology to really feel that they're included and they're part of that. So I think if we ask ourselves basic questions, what's our relationship as a parish like with our bishop? How would we characterize that? How do we think our relationship with our parish priest is? Who do we notice in the community? Whose needs are we aware of? Those are basic kind of relational questions that I think can be quite important to ask. And then I think there are also just basic things in a mission sense that the document's calling us to. Are we really discerning the needs of our communities? How are we doing that? And who's included in that discernment process and who isn't? How do we hear people in our local communities? Again, one of the great joys of the synod is people said, I'm 90 odd years old and the Catholic Church has never asked me my opinion or my view. And people were just overwhelmed that somebody wanted to hear their faith experience. That's just, we have to get better at that. Are we discerning the gifts? We have to assume that there is an abundance of gifts, an abundance of charisms. And are we hearing those? Are we seeing them? Are we nurturing them? Are we forming them? So again, one of the big jigsaw pieces that you'll come to at the end of your book club process is about formation. And we are desperately in need of, this is why the School for Synodality is so important. One of the reasons we are so desperately in need of high quality formation for head and heart and spirit and hands. We really need that. So the document's calling us to really reweave that relational fabric of our basic local church communities. And we don't need Rome or the bishop or anybody else to tell us to do that or to show us how to do it. We know how to do it. We just have to be better at doing it and be willing to try.
It's such brilliant advice. And I think it's really hard. I think
It
that's why
is.
one of the reasons why this document starts in relationships is because it's the hardest thing to do. You can set up parish councils, you can put on formation, but actually, remembering who isn't there on a weekly basis is much trickier. And one of the things we often get asked in the school is, how do I make my priest take part in this process? And we kind of cringe at that point and we say, please do not go and beat your priest around the head with the synod document. Take him out for a coffee and ask him what his dreams for his parish are, because they rarely get to express that to people, and it's about developing those relationships.
And it's about who's not there as well. I mean, one of the things I'm really struck by at the moment is this the movement of young men back into church practice, which is not matched in the same numbers by young women. And
Mm.
so, how do we build relationships with young women to enable them to believe that the church is a home for them? We have a lot of work to do on young women to make that an equal possible reality to the sudden upsurge that we're seeing in their male counterparts.
It's just, Anna, thank you so much. I mean, there's just so much that we could be talking about this evening. I'm going to ask you, what's your favourite line out of this section?
Oh, so I knew you were going to ask me this, so I just need to zip back to on my screen here to the bottom of paragraph 50. So I've been slightly greedy. You have to remember that some of the document was for, even though these are the first documents the Vatican's ever drafted in two languages simultaneously, English and Italian. Some of the sentences you can tell they were first drafted in Italian because they're a paragraph long. So I apologise for this, but here is this is my bit. To be a synodal church, we are required to open ourselves to a genuine relational conversion that redirects each person's priorities. And we must once again learn from the gospel that attending to relationships is not merely a strategy or a tool for greater organizational effectiveness. Relationships and bonds are the means by which God the Father has revealed himself in Jesus and the Spirit. When our relationships, even in their fragility, allow the grace of Christ, the love of the Father, the communion of the Spirit to shine through, we confess with our lives our faith in God the Trinity.
Fabulous. I use a bit of that all the time. It's not just about organizational practices, but growing in communities. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I am going to open to questions now. We've had loads of comments. I've seen loads of stuff coming in. Anna, while people are putting in their questions, and I've got my eye on the time, we're going to get through as many of these as we can. And I think it's all Anna's fault for having given us such an interesting evening. One of the things that came up in the questions while you were speaking was, can you give us a notion of mission? And I think this got asked last week, so I think it would be really interesting to ask you for your take, because how our old-fashioned notion of mission that consists of giving money to people doing it a long way away from us is not present in this document. How do you see the notion of mission in this document?
So this is so mission is God's mission. So this is God's mission for the sustaining, the healing, and the redeeming of every human being, every humanity, and the reconciliation of all creation to God in time, at the end of time. So first of all, mission isn't ours, it's God's, and we participate in that mission because as Catholics, we believe we have this co-creative potential with God, and we participate in the mission of Jesus Christ for the salvation of the whole world. So back to Pope Francis's language, tutti, 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 everyone, 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 no one is excluded. So mission is to the whole earth, to all the peoples of the earth, every culture of the earth. So this isn't just about individuals, but mission is about its relationship to cultures, which is what nurtures the imagination of people. And it's something that every baptized person is called to participate in, the redeeming, sustaining, healing, reconciling, peacemaking mission of Jesus Christ across the face of the earth. So it's always participatory. It doesn't belong to us. It doesn't belong to a single individual. We can't have a possessive ownership relationship to it, and nobody's excluded. So, I mean, just in its biggest, most epic screen terms, that's how I understand mission. And mission is what the church exists for. So the church exists for the sake of serving that mission in time and the participation in that. So mission has to be the telos of everything that we do. So everything is for the sake of that mission, which we are included in. We're not just people who do it for the sake of other people. This is our own salvation. No one is saved alone. This is how we are all bound together.
You know, when I'm talking to parishes, I do say things to them like, how does your parish website express your mission? How does the car parking signage express your mission? You know, how does the invitation to coffee at the end express your mission? How does your Christmas fair express your mission, and it does. Once you get into that tutti mode of thinking, it permeates absolutely everything we do, doesn't it? It
Yeah.
gets much more exciting, I think, than I mean, I've had people say to me, "There's no way I could knock on doors." So it's all right. No, no one's asking you to knock on doors, you know. But we have these very peculiar notions of mission, which means that when we read that word, we sort of don't have to read the rest of the sentence.
And it's also about lives lived. So that, that quote that you said about my favorite line, we confess with our lives our faith. It is how we are. It is the sign we give by the kind of community we are, by how we love each other. See how these Christians love each other. It's as Pope Francis understood, it's gesture as much as word. It's not necessarily just pinning somebody to the wall and very enthusiastically telling them about the gospel, although enthusiastically telling people about the gospel is important too.
Um, I want to, I'm just, here we go. I saw a kind of critique of synodality that often gets sort of discussed, and I think it's fair to kind of raise it here. As Mary Varley says, focusing on unity because of divergence is a recipe for maintaining the status quo. So can you just say a little bit about how, I mean, that does get said, like there's no space here for, because we have to all agree we can never move forward, or there's no place for divergence. And that isn't my experience of synodality, but I just want to give that
It's
to you.
not, yeah, and it's not what's in the text either. And in fact, this very discussion was played out in the world's media during the general congregation days leading up to the conclave. So one version of what we must do in a moment where things feel a bit fractured and a bit divided, and there are many people feeling hurt for different reasons, is we must simply go back to we must accept unity. Is the kind of the main focus of what we should be doing, where unity appears to mean kind of uniformity and not disagreeing. And in response to that, Cardinal Cherney took to the pages of the American press. I can't remember if it was the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times that he started in, but one or the other. And he said, no, 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 this isn't what unity means in the context of Catholicity. And he refocused on the importance of plurality as not a threat to unity, but the very way in which the unity finds itself expressed in the kind of pluriformity of creation is it will be expressed in inherent plurality. Where there's a challenge, and this was central to Pope Francis's own pontificate and his own philosophy, if you like, was trying to discern the difference between tensions that are death dealing, so tensions that produce nothing but harm and hurt, and tensions which are fruitful or are a necessary process of being fallible creatures who learn who we are in history. And that distinction between productive tensions, fruitful tensions, where we have to go down as deeply as possible into the sites of some of those tensions, discerning the difference between that and tensions or differences which are simply conflicts, which are death dealing. For him, this was kind of what the Ignatian tradition helps you to do. And for him, it was what we needed to learn ourselves how to do in the church of our moment, and also accompany the world in doing as well. But we have to be careful to say that plurality as the appropriate condition of the spirit in the world of cultures is different from the question of tensions. And the danger is that we run these two things together, and we need to be careful to understand what we're talking about. But if somebody appears to be using the language of unity to simply sort of silence or homogenize, that's not really what we understand theologically by unity in plurality. It's not what the document understands by that, and it's not what I would understand to be an appropriate Catholic theological understanding of that.
Think I can see where Mary's coming from, because I've certainly sat through kind of parish council meetings where there is a real desire, like we have to be nice, we have to agree, shh, don't rock the boat, don't ask why, we're not thinking about mission in our neighborhood, which is of the needs locally or whatever. So I can see that. But one of the things that I found most helpful in the preparatory, I think it was either the preparatory document or the value maker, one of those early documents where it said, if everybody is agreeing, if everybody in the room is agreeing, you haven't got the right people in the room. And for me, if we don't have that diversity of voices, we're just talking to ourselves. So, Mary, I think that was a really helpful point in that, as a Christian community, we'd like to be nice to each other. But actually, that isn't synodality. And something about that is calling us to experience one another in a way that is a bit heartbreaking sometimes and is uncomfortable, but then pulls us into those deeper relationships, which you were talking about at the beginning, Anna.
Very quickly, the one of the interesting language confusions during the synod process was when Pope Francis would make these interventions, and when he wanted us to disagree more and was worried that we were not honestly getting some of the real disagreements out into the room and divergences, he would plead for harmony and say synodality is about harmony. And the English language speakers in the room, the Anglophones, thought about harmony as don't rock the boat. So they heard him say, don't rock the boat. So we want harmony in this family, meaning don't you dare disagree and we're all on the same page. Whereas what he meant was the harmony of music, of different chords and notes played together, so that there would be harmony, which involves that diversity that makes the sound beautiful. So it's interesting how some of this difficulty is rooted in our imaginations as well.
Yes, I often think about the kind of listening as I'm listening around a table, I'm listening to a group of people sharing that kind of one at a time. It's like a jazz chord, isn't it? You kind of get a bit of disharmony in there, but that's what makes it interesting. It's lovely. I'm going to finish with a really interesting comment from Raymond Lafontaine, who is joining us. I'm pretty sure he's in Montreal. He's one of the Episcopal vicars, but he was also one of the facilitators.
You are. Hi, Raymond.
So great to have people joining us from so far afield. Thank you so much. And Raymond just is asking such a kind of helpful question. What would help? What are some concrete initiatives that would help all who serve in the church, clergy, lay, committed volunteers, everybody, to develop capacity for mature and mutual relationships? And it is certainly the case that somehow all of us leave our life experience in the font as we walk in through the door sometimes, and we don't have capacity for decent, strong, mature relationships. So, let's finish on that note, Anna, of sort of an aspiration to better relationships in the church.
I think to ask people not to suppose that you know, and we're in a moment where we're very used to telling people what we think about things, but actually to be naturally inquisitive and to want to know, hear, carry, and accompany the stories of others, that the honest faith journey of others. People are struggling all the time with things that they have no space or context in which that can be carried, and learning how to ask other people about their faith journey, about their experience, about their prayer life, about where God is for them, not in an interrogating way, but to learn to ask others to hear, to really want to hear that and to share together. So Road to Emmaus stuff. And in that sharing of desolation, of consolation, of hopes, anxieties, anguishes, we can be assured that Christ will appear amongst us.
Well, what a wonderful note to finish on. Thank you so much. And just thank you, Anna, for all that you've shared with us this evening. It's been really, really inspiring. And I think that we are all going to have to go away and do the hard homework of reflecting on our relationships, on our community life, and how that then forms this kind of foundation of moving forward in synodality. So thank you, everybody, as well, for joining us this evening. It's been great. As ever, the conversation has been stimulating and fascinating. Next week, in our next session, we move on to section 3, the conversion of processes. So this then gets into a bit more of the nitty-gritty, reflecting on how ecclesial discernment, that's kind of reflecting together, discerning together, how good decision-making processes and accountability and transparency are essential to our mission. And it may be that there's almost a groan when we talk about accountability and transparency, but the document makes clear how much and how essential all of this is to our mission. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Estela Padilla, a Manila-based theologian and laywoman and a lay delegate to the Rome Assembly, to help unpack this fascinating chapter. And just to warn you folks, next 2 weeks, such is the global reach of our fabulous speakers. We're pre-recording, so we will be bringing along some, for bless her, for Estella, it would literally be 2 o'clock in the morning that she'd be joining us. So we're going to pre-record her, but we'll be joined then by Father Matthew Nunes, who's part of the School for Synodality team, but also in his role as co-moderator of the Liverpool Synod and the ongoing work that he's been doing there. Also has got some great insights on how we apply this in a UK or a Western context. So you get 2 for the price of 1 next week. It just gets better and better. In the meantime, you can find lots of resources on practicing synodality on our website, including for anybody who wants to have a go at these conversations in the spirit. We will be running facilitator training, our regular rounds of facilitator training starting in July. So you can feel that you can do something concrete as a result of engaging with this final document. Do share this webinar with anybody you think would be interested. We had hundreds of watches last week. It was absolutely amazing. And we'll see you again next time. Good night and God bless. Goodbye.